So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And also thank you for joining online. So we have a little bit shorter time in this session because of the delay from the previous one, but we'll continue after lunch, and then we have another hour and a half after that. So we have about a little over an hour now to work together. And so I'll start with kind of a lecture fleshing out about so kind of expanding on the basis of my book, Algorithm Image Art, which I introduced in my keynote on Wednesday. And we'll start to kind of get into this like deeper history of algorithmic image production and contextualizing contemporary artistic practice with algorithmic processes, and look at some of the historical threads that are converging in the current predominance of generative processes of image making. And then in the second part, we'll get into a more participatory activity where we'll be trying to conceptualize how this might be relevant to us as practitioners, and how can we conceive of our own practices in a more cybernetic sense, or in a way of like diagramming how our relationship is with algorithms. So yeah, maybe just to kind of also give you guys something to look into. I'll pass around my book, and then I have some prints that I made for my recent project. So if you guys can each have one of these if you'd like. As I mentioned, my work right now, in the workshop kind of centers on my recently published book, Algorithm Image Art. And this has been kind of a very long undertaking that expands on the work that I was doing in my PhD, which was practice-led research into machine learning and trying to understand some of the historical discourses that inform our present context. So in this, my keynote has kind of focused primarily on the first part of the title, so algorithms, defining what we mean by algorithms, and introducing the idea of algorithmic image production. So how do we conceive of image production as being shaped by algorithms? So I'll kind of recap that here for anybody that wasn't here on Wednesday for the keynote, and just to kind of refresh what our minds about what we're talking about. So algorithms have become seemingly ubiquitous in the past few years, and their influence is not always visually nor conceptually accessible to us when we are encountering algorithmic media. And so for that reason, I find it really necessary to kind of dig deeper into what does this really mean for us when we're dealing with visual culture. So I often describe my work as dealing with what is behind the algorithmic image, and that has several layers of meaning. So because I focus on historical narratives around technology, I look at like the deeper history that is temporally behind the algorithmic image. So looking at earlier forms of algorithmic image making than we might immediately associate with this. But also in the very literal sense, I'm also talking about the processes that go on behind the algorithmic image. So how does process affect what we see, but also how does the process affect how we think about what we see when we encounter visual media that is heavily engaging algorithms. So something that has been very, very significant in the history of visual technologies is, of course, the history of photography. And that brought with it many questions about the role of technology in our perceptual experience, also our conceptualizations of media. And this has been interpreted in many different ways. But one of those, and I kind of introduced this the other day, is this idea of the mechanical nature of photography, distancing the point of view from the human agent. So there's this, at once there's kind of an alignment, and I use this photo to kind of show this, like, we have this association of the camera view being kind of one-to-one interchangeable for the human visual perception. But at the same time, we kind of conceptualize it as like separate, that it's the machine that is performing the act of this like interpreting vision or capturing visuality. So there's this kind of strange ambiguity that ends up being introduced, where we kind of say two opposing things at the same time. So like photography before it, this new paradigm shift in visual media with the rise of machine learning becoming very, very common in the interpretation of visual data now. Like photography before it, this hasn't canceled out the previous paradigms that came before it, even though there was an idea of photography eclipsing, like being a very threatening technology to earlier forms of visual media, such as painting. And there was a major backlash against photography because of this perceived threat that it would render painting possibly obsolete, which obviously we haven't seen that happen. It merely changed things. And something that I find really, really interesting about that is the way that algorithmic visual media can kind of consume other forms of image making and very much coexist with them at the same time. So just as an example, so on the left, it's an image from thispersondoesnotexist.com. And then on the right, we have just a regular portrait, photographic portrait, and then below a painting, a digital photograph of a painting. And I kind of like to show these images together because they show a similar subject matter, a similar kind of stylistic tendency of the portrait. And then, especially in the one on the left, you see how aspects of like a painterly style and a photographic style can actually be kind of copied or integrated into machine learning generated images. And so rather than being very like mutually exclusive, these paradigms are like very much like mingling in generated images. So what I find kind of interesting about this as well is that the extent to which the processes involved, or like the interpretation of the data behind the image, ends up affecting the final image is not always like interpretable to us. It's we only kind of get part of the story by actually looking at an image. And so I would argue that now, as a result of this, our images increasingly require us to have a higher degree of technical literacy in order to interpret them. And this pushes a drive towards increasing consideration of process, more so than thinking of images as these physically individuated and above all visual objects. So this emphasis on process and interpretation recalls aspects from art history, and especially in conceptualism, where there are several layers of interpretation that go into understanding a work. So this emphasis on process very much is crucial to a very central concept that is very influential in this field of image studies currently. And this was put forth by Harun Farokhi, who was himself an artist, but also wrote very important theories on this topic. But he coined this term, the operative image or the operational image, and he conceptualized images now as being concerned far more with what he called like the performance of spatial operations. And he even kind of went so far as to say that these images, they're not representative of objects in the real world, but they perform operations. So we can think of them as, you know, he wasn't specifically looking at generated images, but actually more in the machine vision and like robotic computer vision of drones and autonomous machines being able to navigate on their own. And he was really radical in trying to think about these spatial operations that machines are able to perform as transforming our understanding of what vision might be. Because what occurs in machine vision occurs in like radically different terms than our human optical vision. And importantly too, he was drawing on Roland Barthes and who had this conception of operative language, and talking about how language actually acts upon us and it acts upon the world. So I think that's like also a crucial aspect to think of when we think about Harun Farokhi's work and our conceptualizations of the operative image, is that we're not just talking about the performance of these spatial procedures, but also like, how does this act on the world? Like, how does this not only transform our understanding of these things, but how does this actually, you know, in a very concrete sense, change the world? So that kind of just gives like a very short like overview of what we're getting into. But just to kind of like summarize the topic that we're looking into. So my book seeks to develop a better understanding of the historical threads that converge in the use of algorithmic approaches in recent artistic practice. And so looking into this the other day, on Wednesday, we were really looking at the geometric structuring of visual compositions. And for that, we started with Ptolemy's Geographia, which was he compiled this almost 2,000 years ago. But in spite of how old that example is, I find that it gives us a really compelling way of thinking about the transcription of visual information or data in alphanumeric form. And it very much revolutionized map making when it became more widely accessible. So he outlined very specific instructions and these tables of geographic data, and effectively gave algorithmic constraints for how this data was to be plotted into a visual form. And that, as I kind of went into the other day, it absolutely revolutionized map making because it used this grid-like, spatial coordinate system, and then it allowed, so obviously this book was compiled 2000 years ago, so we don't have the physical original, but many copies of that book and copies of the copies have been made. And through that process of like kind of copying of copies and transcribing the data, we have the original data from which we can actually draw out the maps. And as a result of that, there's also, I think it's really interesting to be able to look at, like, there's no original really, and especially not existing now. So it's all about the interpretation of the data into visual form. And so there's many different versions of this, and there's different schools of thought on how to project the data into a map. And that kind of also recalls some of the iterability that we are now familiar with in generative art and computational art. But another way that we can think about the algorithmic structuring of visual compositions is through geometric canons of representation. So anthropometric systems, for example, and these we can find, even ancient examples of this where algorithmic sets of constraints were then applied to the portrayal of the human body and like the kind of correct or divine proportions. And maybe the example we might be most familiar with is the center one, which is known as the Vitruvian Man. It's depicting the male body inscribed within a circle and a square, which was at the time believed to be kind of these divine proportions that, like, through the articulation of these geometric forms, we're actually, and this harmony of aesthetics, we're achieving kind of divinity, or like it's a kind of an encounter with the divine, which I think is kind of an interesting like way of thinking about geometry, because it's quite different from how we think about it now in like quite dry, scientific terms and mathematical terms. So on architecture, Vitruvius gives like very detailed instructions for how to draw this man. And just to give, like, it's very long, but just to give you like a tiny excerpt from that, he says, the face from the chin to the top of the forehead and the lowest roots of the hair is a 10th part of the whole height. The head from the chin to the crown is an 1/8, and with the neck and shoulder from the top of the breast to the roots of the hair is a 6th. So he's kind of explaining how all of these tiny parts actually are interrelated geometrically with each other. And based on these internal proportional relationships, you can make more or less the same portrayal that he's laid out. So we can also think about linear perspective in similar terms, where spatial and optical relationships are then embedded into a flat image. And this notably like had a very important role in art history in structuring the way that we see through images. And Brunelleschi, who's credited as maybe the first to have a highly developed methodology for using linear perspective in image making. He also invented this experimental device that he proposed to use for like verifying the accuracy of images using linear perspective. So you had to actually kind of destroy the image that you were working with in order to use it, but you would put a hole in the center of the image and then peer through that at this mirror. And then you could actually, that would allow you to compare half of your vision would be filled with a reflected version of your perspectival image, and then against the view that it was supposed to replicate. And I really kind of like this kind of strange device or method that he devised, because it's very poetic in a way of our understanding of what optical images do and like how they relate to the world, that we kind of assume this one-to-one alignment between the image and reality. So I always kind of love to try to understand, because, you know, looking at very, very old examples from art history or even just visual applications of technologies in general, I'm really interested in how that shapes the way that we see. And I think this painting is a really fascinating example that might give us a little bit of insight into how we might have seen before linear perspective, or, you know, we're all so immersed in photography or photographic aesthetics that it's hard for us to even conceptualize a world without those things. But I think this example is really fascinating because it's a pre-perspectival painting where foreshortening is like really going wrong, and this person who is like trying to gaze upward, their whole face is kind of being warped over this sphere of their head. And I think maybe we could liken this to some of the mistakes that we find in generative AI systems now, where we see it's less and less that we can very, very concretely be able to point out where it goes wrong. But I think this is a kind of interesting parallel that we can think about, like, okay, there were ways of conceptualizing representation that really don't align with how we see now, and even the fact that this could be painted that way, and like the artist did not see what was going wrong there. So to kind of like bring this back a bit more to more, I would say, like contemporary methods or ways of understanding algorithmic image making. In the work of Sol LeWitt, we find kind of a fascinating way of using algorithmic approaches in his wall drawings. So he used these proportional relationships within the context of the work, where the works were installed. So he would have kind of a method and like a recipe or algorithm for making the wall drawing. But if you've seen these installed in a museum context, if you've seen the same drawing installed in multiple contexts, you find that it's the same drawing, but it ends up being articulated in a very slightly different way. But this elasticity of the algorithm allows it to be kind of conceived of as the same drawing. This kind of instructional approach allows the artist to kind of outline this method that is then applied. So that's just it's a very grainy image when it's blown up. But basically had this way of, like in this particular drawing, he says that the wall is to be divided into 15 vertical sections in which various combinations of colored lines are repeated and then methodically overlapped. What I think is really fascinating about this example is it kind of embodies this conceptualization of like the idea being a machine that makes the art. And we can of course think about algorithms as being, you know, part of this kind of machine. So this gives us a little bit of just an overview of the geometric and optical structuring of visual compositions. And then also, of course, the embedding of spatial information into the image plane. And that has enabled the transcription of images in alphanumeric form. And of course, like their transcodability. So we can think about the image as being kind of existing and then transcribed and then re-articulated. So this possibility of transcribing images in alphanumeric form facilitates the automation of visual processing tasks, notably in computer programming. And of course, the mechanization and like automation of image making changed not only the methods, but the aesthetic norms of images. And this kind of idea of that we're existing in something that's been called a culture of the copy. So content is replicated at will, and of course, seriality held quite significant implications as we saw like in the introduction of mass media. And a lot of that has been centered on the labor involved in the production of images. And so of course, this was like historically raised quite a bit in relation to the printing press, which brought about the widespread availability of books. And then of course, a radically different way of being able to transmit knowledge and information. But something that automation of image making also brought with it was something that I tend to think about in terms of technical literacy and how our understanding of a technology actually shapes the way that we interpret the images. So an example that I quite like to talk about that, how cultural expectations of technology change the way we see their outputs, is something known as the Cottingley Ferries incident, where at the beginning of the 20th century, there were two young girls who had access to their father's camera and made this series of photographs that appeared to depict them in a garden surrounded by fairies. And at the time, these caused a stir because people really didn't understand the affordances of the technology enough to be able to say concretely, like, that is not possible. So there was this suspension of disbelief, like maybe these are actually presenting concrete physical evidence of the existence of fairies. And I think this kind of thinking is like important to recall now as we're dealing with emerging technologies, where we tend to have this suspension of disbelief when we deal with technologies that we don't know their limits or we don't really concretely understand them. We have a tendency to kind of be more vulnerable to possibly manipulations or exaggerations of the power of the technology. So in spite of photography's proven capacity to manipulate appearances, such as like in the previous example of the fairies, it nevertheless continues to hold this connotation of being a mirror of reality and accurately portraying reality. But in the early days of photography, it was quickly adopted in scientific contexts because it allowed particular kinds of scientific objectivity to be achieved in capturing realistic likenesses. So, for example, in capturing the first accurate images of snowflakes, and that kind of allowed us to see in a new way, because we could actually fix the image and examine it more closely, or examine through microscopy or other methods. This was also quickly applied to contexts such as in crime scene photography. And Alphonse Bertillon was very an early innovator in that area. And he developed a technique that I think is quite fascinating called the portrait palette, where that was kind of the early, we could consider it as an early precursor to the mugshot. So, and the reason that it was called that was originally a lot of these crime data would be based on these accounts, like witness accounts, kind of correlating whatever visual data they might have with some kind of description. So there we already see this kind of interrelationship between image and text, or like visuals and like a verbal account. But he started innovating this methodology of compiling and like compositing multiple images of many suspects and their different traits, and trying to kind of narrow down leads, like crime leads from whatever visual data they might have. So you might have like, okay, these are the different eyes from some people that were known to be at the scene of the crime, and then we could kind of corroborate and narrow down the list of suspects based on which one more closely aligned with more witness accounts. But this, of course, similar techniques were used in very dubious contexts. So this one is from Cesare Lombroso, who he had a very phrenological take on how photography or visual depictions of crime suspects might give insights into what he thought of as a visual look of criminality. And so this was like very, very deeply problematic. He developed, based on similar, like kind of a similar basis to Alphonse Bertillon, he then tried to kind of narrow down, like, okay, many crime suspects have this particular nose and they have these particular eyes. So I'll composite them into these types of criminal looks so that we can identify criminals just by looking at them. And that, as absurd and obviously problematic as that is now, there are still obviously situations where similar ideas are being applied in machine learning contexts. And that's like a very, very concerning tendency that we need to kind of remember how things like this have played out in the past. So just one example, but there are really numerous examples existing. Several years ago, there was a study released from Stanford University where they went about using machine learning to identify what they identified as like a typical homosexual face. And they used machine learning to kind of, differentiate based on input data. They would collect images of people and then try to develop a system that would be able to correctly categorize if somebody was a homosexual or not. And this, of course, like, luckily there was a lot of backlash, but this kind of thinking is sadly very common, and often it occurs in ways that are less obvious than this. So just touching on a trope, kind of pivoting a little bit away from that kind of situations of bias. Something that I find kind of interesting when we look at a lot of machine learning generated images, there is kind of a trope of presenting images in this composite view, in a way that kind of is reminiscent of some of these earlier examples, like Bertillon's portrait palais. Another example that is kind of more esoteric, but also I find really kind of poetic or insightful in a kind of unusual way, is Aby Warburg's Mnemosyne Atlas, which he described as seeking to map the afterlife of antiquity. So he composed these panels. I think there were 36 of them originally. So it was like this massive undertaking. But he was trying to perform a kind of cultural analysis of images by arranging them in a similar way to Bertillon's portrait palais, where by placing images, like by juxtaposing images, multiple images together, you could kind of compare and contrast similarities and try to kind of understand them through relationships, like interrelationships between them. And of course, like in a kind of another parallel to things we've been talking about, like the original panels no longer exist, but there have been replicas made of this this installation that he kind of made for himself. And I have started thinking about these in terms of like composite images, and where it's notable that we get these multiple images within one composition, while they also kind of retain some degree of autonomy within the system. I think it's interesting to kind of consider that in relation to the many-to-one or many-to-many relationships of images in generative systems, where there can be massive amounts of visual data behind a system, but then we produce like individual images based on those. And then the relationships between the many and the one are really not very clear. And to some extent, we could maybe think of these as like composites. Yeah, we very much lose the distinction of like the relationships between the many images and the one. Kind of getting into like yet another like problematic aspect of that. There was I mentioned a project that became really very popular for talking about generated images several years ago, called This Face Does Not Exist. And many people kind of, and this is the tendency, like many people were just very impressed by that project's ability to realistically produce photographic images of human faces. And that project itself was about like trying to address some of the security like problems of that people could generate images and use fake identities. But researchers have subsequently kind of looked more closely at the data of that original project, and then actually found that that project reproduces images from its training data. So there have been actual specific instances of people saying that that system has made pictures of me because I am in the training data. And so I find that kind of interesting, how on the one hand, like the whole idea of this person does not exist, is that we're able to produce these likenesses that are very believable, that don't coincide with reality, but at the same time, they sometimes do. So we're kind of not able to rule out either possibility. And yeah, so it's increasingly difficult for us to understand these images, this flood of images that we exist within on an ongoing basis, as separate from the data. Something that's really kind of problematic within image studies and like trying to theorize all of this, is that like even before all of this was really occurring, within image studies, it was already a problem for theorists and philosophers to actually develop image ontologies. So this is a really well-known text by W.J.T. Mitchell, who is one of the most prominent image theorists. And what I find really fascinating about that work is that if anybody were to know what an image is, it would be the authority on images, W.J.T. Mitchell. And for him to be asking what is an image and not really actually being able to answer his own question, I think that leaves us with a really fascinating conundrum. But so in attempting to answer his own question, what is an image, he developed this taxonomy of different kinds of images. And he made this, what he calls a family tree of images, where he kind of, at least is able to outline different ways that images can exist. I think that's kind of really interesting if we would kind of go back to, again, I feel like early conceptualism was already really plumbing the depths of some of these very deep philosophical questions. You know, even just trying to think about how an image or a concept can be conveyed between different forms and articulated in numerous ways. So if we apply this to images, we're able to kind of think about how images are not strictly defined by their visual qualities. So just for example, if we have like a JPEG image file on our desktop, it's still arguably an image, even if it's not visualized as such. So like the kind of image qualities of the image are in this latent sense existing. But so this kind of brings us to the problem of latency in algorithmic images. So especially when we try to think about images being transcoded between different forms and existing in a non-visualized state, where they're not articulated. So this also gets even more problematic if we think about the proliferation of images and how they can be kind of endlessly reproduced in theory. And we could make infinite copies of an image, and how do we kind of conceptualize the relationship between, like, is that mass of potential reproductions the image, or is it the code? And where is the image actually situated? And Galloway has a really nice way of discussing this, where he says, consider the case of Wikipedia, a singular data image produced by thousands and thousands of end users on their laptops. So a single networked image has this kind of paradoxical capacity to be visualized in this very dispersed way. An example that I quite like for kind of trying to understand also that transcodability or interpretability of algorithmic images is a work by ArtNode, where they created this piece called the File Room. And it's just a room filled with these kind of strange, blobby, 3D printed objects. And then when you read more about them, you find out that these are material interpretations of files from ArtNode's archives. So some of them are actually physical instantiations of music files or video or images, and they have come up with some way to turn them into objects. And what I really like about that example is that it kind of, it has this way of being able to stretch how we think about the relationship between a file and its articulation. And if we could even conceive of an image as being an object, and like a dimensional form and not just this surface. So yeah, machine learning allows believable simulations to be produced based on these statistical models, based on multitudes of other images. And it's kind of relevant to our context that it's beyond our capacity to actually look at and interpret all of this data. So we always get this kind of interpreted form. And notably, beyond just like generating images, algorithms also play a role in processing visual data and like how it's displayed. So this work by Renee Ridgway, it's terribly pixelated here, I'm sorry. But she was looking at, through her PhD project, she used two different laptops through the duration of her PhD. One which she called the personalized self, and one which was the non-personalized. And so, of course, the personalized one was like, take all my cookies, like, store all the cookies, like, gather all my data, and then give me this personalized interpretation of the internet. And then the non-personalized one was trying to kind of keep her laptop as clean as possible and as like non-personalized. And so what this visualizes is discrepancies between the searches performed on the non-personalized laptop and the personalized, and kind of showing how what you end up seeing is just very much distorted based on these algorithmic interpretations of a self, which I think is kind of fascinating because again, we tend to not have very much access into the function of these systems. So being able to develop such a methodology to actually attempt to visualize like what the difference is already kind of a step. So all of this kind of results in what Shane Denson refers to as a discorrelation. So we're kind of existing with like a discorrelation between various ways of visualizing and interpreting. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, this highlights the importance of process in contemporary understandings of images. I'm thinking maybe we just take like a short pause for if anybody has questions, because I feel like I've been like hammering you with a lot of concepts so far. Yeah.
Excuse me, what of the slide that you showed was like 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, like with the colors? Soloist.
Oh, yes. That's Soloist. And yeah, so his name is at the bottom, very, very small.
I really like this comparison with the author piece when you talked about perspective and how it was perceived back then and so on. And at the same time, I was reminded that there's also something like a talent and maybe also like a child view, something which is super new, and then we don't know exactly the technique, how to reproduce it. So also seeing this author piece as maybe some like an untalented artist trying to trying to AI like learning, and maybe there's unprogressed stage of machine learning and so on. It's
Yeah,
just my comment. I'm not sure if it's a direct question.
but it's interesting. Yeah, like this, it also brings up how some of our discussions about which qualities are important in art and like which qualities are valued, and where artists, of course, have been, you know, we look out for our bottom line. So we look at like, where can I differentiate myself from the whatever is the next threatening technology? So of course, you know, before perspective, there was more like this need for skill and talent and observing very closely. Or not after photography, then there was this like, okay, now I need to be conceptual because, okay, anybody can now reproduce somebody's image very realistically. So I think it's kind of no wonder that we saw this turn towards conceptualism that we have, or, you know, Impressionism was kind of the direct response, contemporary response to the widespread use of photography. So I find that kind of interesting also, just to look at these paradigm shifts too, of like, you know, maybe kind of going back also to like Renaissance era forms of aesthetics, mannerism maybe being an answer to the realism of optical perspective, because we get these very, very stylized visualizations like, okay, yes, we can make a 3D, like believable 3D space, but we want to know, like, we want the sublime of the angels and kind of this highly aesthetic interpretation of the vision. So I do think that's kind of interesting, like how would we conceptualize now, like where is the skill or where is the importance of talent, or what is our role as practitioners? Like where do we put our value? Like, and that's, you see that very much in some of the stuff about like prompt engineering, where people will kind of say like, I can come up with the best prompts and or it's like what you use it for, or how you reinterpret what the system actually does, more so. And maybe that's kind of similar, where we're able to very realistically reproduce images, but then that kind of quickly becomes uninteresting to viewers.
Yeah, currently we have all those tools around, yes, but they are like based on specific data sets, so we get specific style and synthetic images and etc. And I wanted to share my experience in this context because I'm a lecturer in art academy teaching German tools.
I'm just going to try to.
Invited in 2022. It was when the hype started, when the cultural paradigm started, and I was like confused how to teach something so fluid, something so ever changing and unpredictable. And then I dived into the research about the open source models that we can train ourselves. And I started to learn together with students. And so we now are training our models in Art Academy we are making character models, we are making like art style models, so the artist can work later with sketches or prototypes, and maybe that's the answer. We have to, like you already mentioned, we have to understand technology, yes, and it's changed the way we look at the output. So I think it's, yeah, goes together. And also my aim was to, make like to teach, to understand the technology for our students so they can control it and have the in the end have the outputs they really want. Yes, it's like more control, gives you more possibilities to control that. Sorry, I floated the market. I hope, it's another example of how we can use technologies. I'm also very thankful for your presentation and your dissertation, because it's not only very useful for media artists and media researchers, but it's actually a very good methodology. I'm sorry, I can't spell, maybe someone here, methodology. Yes, for the students. So I definitely will include your VÄLINA lectures, your examples. Thank you very much.
I have a question. When you talk about this concept of this importance of process in image creation, does this importance of process kind of, because like for me, the most, how I understand this concept is that when you're looking at an image, you can tell how, like, without having any, context of how it was created, that there is some visual indicators of how it was made, whether it is, if it's like some telltale signs of AI, but also of, for example, now with the kind of rising popularity of more analog photography, for example, being like better fashion again, where it is, because it looks a certain way, you kind of can tell how it was made. And so maybe what is your kind of view on that, like connection of the process and the aesthetics?
And that's I think like a really fascinating aspect right now, because as these generative systems get better, you see a kind of erasure of the correlation between the process and the aesthetics. But yeah, so just to kind of rewind, like that's something that is really fascinating with what we're seeing right now is very much kind of like what I was highlighting in This Person Does Not Exist, is like we can't rely on this correlation between what the image looks like and some kind of material reality behind it, or even the process of the interpretation. But at the same time, we can't rule it out entirely. So what we're seeing is like an increasing need for methods to be able to interpret the process and like interpret like how to make sense of what we see. And something that I was going to show next, actually, that I'll just kind of jump into because it really relates. Okay, so one project that I find really fascinating for kind of talking about this lack of a visible correlation between an image and then what's going on behind it or beyond it is what's called the one pixel attack. And it's a technical paper and experiment where the researchers were able to kind of prove they were able to modify just one pixel in an image significantly enough that it would be misinterpreted by a machine learning system. And so this kind of demonstrates how there can be like a really, really strong discorrelation between how an image is interpreted by humans and then how it's interpreted by machines. So this chart kind of just shows they would take one image and then based on where the attack was placed, like the attacking pixel was placed, then the same image would be categorized as 9 different image classes. So that's fairly interesting in terms of like, if that's possible, then we can extrapolate like how significant this difference in how we interpret images is. But something that I find like this experiment is already several years old, so it's more than 5 years old. So it's not the most up-to-date technical paper on this subject, but something that I'm very critical about, like if you look at engineering papers, they often have like kind of strange assumptions that are very obvious to us as visual artists or as cultural practitioners. But if you look at this image, like that is allegedly that's a dog, but you know, like it's a very pixelated blob of something, but it's not really, I wouldn't categorize that as a dog. And then so to kind of prove that this is miscategorized by computers is also like, okay, yes, but so we have some caveats there that we're dealing with. Some of their other examples are like better. They actually look like the thing that they're supposed to be categorized as. But as a technical demonstration, it's like fairly interesting. Yeah, and I guess kind of like going back to your question, like I think that's something that we're really increasingly reckoning with. Is like, how do we, like, what kind of methods then could we even devise for dealing with this? So we could have like technical methodologies, but I think increasingly, and especially what we're seeing with like deep fakes, it's like we need conceptual infrastructure more even than the technical infrastructure. Like we need conceptual frameworks to be able to cope with this kind of visuality, because I think you know, and even the thing about like how widespread fake news is and misinformation, and how incredibly influential it is altering you know, political elections and like massively changing what people's sense of reality. You know, this goes very far beyond just like the generation of images or like real believable representations. And maybe in the sense like recalling Faroki, this is algorithms acting on the world through, you know, through visualizations, but also these like more widespread ways that they get kind of integrated into the fabric of reality. So I find that really, really fascinating. But also like maybe just to kind of pick up on other aspects of what you were mentioned, like this return to kind of nostalgia of like, I've had students who they get like dumb phones, and like that's been really popular as like 90s digital cameras with like, I don't know, like tiny memory and like super pixelated images. I think that's kind of fascinating, is like often when we see hyper-realism, there's the backlash immediately of like mannerism or, you know, new aesthetics, and I think maybe also to kind of bounce off of what you were talking about, like techno-positivist perspectives, is like,
I don't know where I would place myself because I'm like coming from critical theory, so I'm always the negative Nancy in the room being like technology is bad, but like we need to know about it. But I think it's kind of interesting like how we can find ways of working with the technology or like working against it even, but like by intimately understanding what's actually going on. And so like training, teaching students to train models or like develop their own systems or finding new applications for it is really maybe a great way of going about that.
Some of the students are very like very acceptable to this technology, and some of them are really like, no, this is not for me. But still, they are like trying and experimenting, and I allow them to express conceptually their opinion about if it's a critical approach against the AI technology in final work. Yeah, so still everyone learns the methods, but in the end they have the final work where they can like show their attitude against the technology. They're techno-positive or like critical. So it's not that we have a lot of we have different attitudes.
Oh, there's another question.
Back on music, so I'm approaching this from audio side, the discussion there is pretty much similar. It doesn't have to be machine learning or AI, but in general digital tools that makes music creation or enables that to many people that doesn't maybe have skills. And now there's much more emphasis on showing the process of making music, and that's kind of appreciated more in many different formats. So is there already new ways to exhibit visual art in a way that it's not just the output, but also the process? And what are those methods to kind of in an exhibition show the audience the process of making it?
I think that's difficult. Yeah, and I think that's maybe that's what we're kind of tasked with as this generation of practitioners working with this of like, I think there's different schools of thought and there's different kind of styles, and I do find that really interesting. Sometimes there's a tendency, I've seen quite a lot of works where it's leaning very heavily on the meaning of the process. And that I'm quite critical of as well, that, okay, this is a seemingly quite ordinary thing, but it was made by an AI, so therefore it's special. And I think there's I think we've seen already an early wave of that, and I think already people are a little bit tired of it. So there's kind of new approaches. Well, where do we find our value again? And actually, it's funny because we, in the opening, just for context, we specifically we were watching the performance, the dinner, which was hosted by an AI, and there's this audio narration, and we were sitting in the back going, but is it an AI? Like, is the voice actually? And I was convinced at first that it was like a human narrator who was getting texts generated by AI, and then he was just reading them to us. But then we kind of figured out, I think we determined, yeah, we didn't like conclusively figure out, we didn't pass the Turing test. But I think we kind of concluded that it was a model that was trained on both of the artists, like the collaborating artists' voices, and then it was this kind of hybrid from their voices. And he, being an audio person, he was like, oh, this error, there was like an error in
So I don't believe that AI would create that kind of mind-blowing sound when the person's speaking louder. So I know it might be, I don't know.
But that's something like I find really fascinating too, is like maybe in the first, what I would categorize as like an early wave of AI art. Many artists were really fascinated with the errors and like where AI goes wrong. And I think we're kind of at a phase where that's not that trendy anymore, and we're not that fascinated by it anymore. Because a lot of early projects were like, oh, look at the AI being stupid, or like, this is where it's kind of making a dumb mistake. Sometimes the mistakes are more fascinating, like some of the generated images where you see like the whole thing about it like being really difficult to generate like teeth. Like these models will make images with people with like thousands of teeth, and like, or I don't know, 15 fingers, you know, which I also kind of, again, find really fascinating, like computers and, you know, generative models being bad at counting, like specifically bad at numbers, is really a fascinating paradox, like that, how that can go wrong in this computational system. But I think maybe that's also where we're seeing like those are maybe the superficial, like low-hanging fruit problems, and the real like hardcore philosophical problems that we have are much more problematic to understand, let alone communicate. And so I think that's where like we're seeing a diversity of approaches to dealing with AI in art, like, and not specifically through just generating directly content. So I kind of go into that. I'm gonna like skip way forward. Oh, this is okay. Actually, these are images from that same paper that I was mentioning before, where it's like the 1 pixel attack on images, and those are kind of more. That looks more like a deer, and that looks more like a dog than the other previous one. Yeah.
Because we shifted the discussion, which we have done from the generation of images to the perception of images. And this is a different chapter, because it's probably to improve how the perception of images can be improved by taking the perceptual aspect into account. And this is very interesting. And I would like to ask you if you have been working on the fact that, for example, with eye tracking or saccadic tracking, we can have average kind of ethnical data. Maybe persons are looking at images very differently. You start on the left side and the right side, according to if they read from the left to the right or from the top to down and so on. So ethnical bias as well when we read an image. And saccadic image tracking is something also that feeds back. I mean, it's not only this kind of, oh, is this a lorry? Is this just mark where the railway station is on the image? But this feeds back on the image production. And in how far is there this ethnic bias when you read from the left to the right? And how does this algorithmic data production goes into the production of the image? I mean, there's a lot of art projects right now, I mean, that deal with the actual looking at images, starting with, for example, Christian Sommer and Mignonios. I mean, tracing where you look into the image, and the more time you spend in front of the image, the more value it gives to the image.
Yes, I love it.
I saw a Korean piece recently in Seoul, where you have a pizza delivery service, and with eye tracking and with augmented reality, just where the delivering guy looks. And this becomes the algorithmic analysis of where it looks, where it deposits the parcel in front of the door, becomes the artwork. And this is becoming algorithmic artwork, but these data fit into the way that we are optimizing the way of producing images. So I don't know, is this also part of where you're going, or do you have some of these aspects between production to perception in your own work?
That I have not been really covering, at least in this book, but I'm in my kind of continuation on that. I've been looking at notions of objectivity and kind of trying to understand some kind of an elaboration on some of these ideas of kind of moving forward from the history of photography and some of those ideas of the objectivity of images that we kind of really embedded in visual culture from that history. But no, like that is a really fascinating part. I mean, to some extent in my PhD, I was looking at the interpretive part, like so the analysis of images, and specifically something that I've been looking at quite a lot is like adversarial images and adversarial approaches, which are so if just to get like a show of hands, is anyone here familiar with adversarial approaches or adversarial images? No. Okay, fabulous, because it's a topic that I love. So adversarial approaches in machine learning so they're approaches to machine learning that seek to actually exploit these errors. So if we would think about like, you know, white hat hackers, they seek to kind of expose the mistakes that a system will make. And usually it's in this white hat or approach, at least from the development side and research side, because for example, if you're deploying some kind of AI system and it has some kind of easily hackable mistakes, then you really want to know about them so that you can actually make the system more robust. Also just for situations of like, you know, bias and inaccuracy. So adversarial images are images that are created as like attacking inputs for these systems, where the image itself is actually, it is triggering an error in the system. So those one pixel attack images that we were looking at before, those are adversarial images. And that technique is a kind of an adversarial approach. So this, so what I'm showing right now are from a project called Deep Neural Networks Are Easily Fooled. And they, this is also a little bit old. They made a system that could generate images that would like take down or attack a machine learning system meant to categorize images. So these were just meant to like trigger miscategorizations, but you can extrapolate, like there are adversarial approaches that are meant to kind of actually break like a machine vision systems or algorithmic systems. So what I find really interesting about this project is, so they kind of proved how easy it was to generate images that would be miscategorized. But kind of, again, like this is a kind of like a handpicked selection of examples that are kind of making their point more thoroughly. But if you actually look at their data, a lot of their examples are kind of similar to what we were seeing in the previous one, where okay, some of these might like, okay, this one is supposed to be categorized, it's accidentally miscategorized as a spider web. But something that I find problematic about this project is that they assume that there is this kind of, that every image has a category. And basically all they did is like create abstraction. So like by creating abstract images, they are able to kind of say like, none of these images should be categorized in a category, yet we're putting it into a system that makes every image fit a category. And that assumes a category for every image. So that's kind of yet again where I find it kind of problematic, like the engineer mentality towards images and visuality is really, really different from what we kind of understand from a cultural perspective, where even just like if you make a system that assumes every image has a category, you're already inserting the error there yourself. But I guess like typically the focus is like on accuracy, like, performing a task, this like very practical goal, and then the system can kind of function fairly well in most circumstances where it's applied. But I find that kind of interesting for us, like, what can we do with these insights of like kind of seeing where engineers might get it wrong, or seeing where machine learning systems, as a result of the engineers getting it wrong, then get it wrong. I think that's kind of food for continuation to look at this. Just as like an example to kind of get into that, like the duck rabbit image used in psychology, our capacity to see an image of a duck and a rabbit based on how we focus our mind is like a kind of radically different way of interpreting images from what's going on in this computational sense. So I find that kind of fascinating. Okay. Yeah. I'm in the habit now of like I kind of like things to be open-ended, so I prepare like twice as many slides as I need, just in case we need them. But so after the lunch break, we're going to have a participatory drawing activity where we will be conceptualizing how algorithms and algorithmic processes relate to our own practices. So kind of trying to apply what we've been discussing to a more personal context. So like, each of you, either as artists or musicians or curators or theorists, how is this relevant? Is it relevant? And like which parts? And so we'll be actually looking at a model developed by an early cybernetician, Stafford Beers. So he developed this way of conceptualizing systems called the viable systems model. And yeah, so we'll be kind of just discussing that model and a little bit of the history of cybernetics, and trying to kind of conceptualize ourselves in similar terms. So like what kind of systems are we enmeshed in? How do algorithms maybe regulate these relationships? And how can we kind of use them to achieve some kind of particular output? Okay, so for you joining online as well, we're going to start the session again. So the timeline has been kind of tweaked a little bit because the morning session went late, and then we kind of keep rolling back. But they suggested that we end on time, and then if you guys want to stick around and discuss more, then we kind of can, but we'll kind of just close things at the planned time.
Which is?
4:10. So that's in like 50 minutes. So it will be a little bit short, but in a way, I feel like we'll kind of cover the major concepts. And then really what I wanted to do with you guys is just a little bit of reflection on and discussion on what we've been doing today anyway. So kind of the main framing that I thought we could work on in this second part is to talk about like how do algorithms or how could algorithms inform your work? So are you integrating algorithmic practices already, or are you kind of interested in doing so, or is this something that you're kind of just experiencing from kind of a distance? So as I mentioned before we left, I thought we could kind of take inspiration from this model called the viable systems model. And it was created by Stafford Beer, who was a cybernetician who had some kind of wild and innovative ideas. And so according to Andrew Pickering, who wrote a book called The Cybernetic Brain, he says in 1959, Stafford Beer published a book imagining an automated factory controlled by a biological computer, perhaps a colony of insects, or perhaps a complex ecosystem such as a pond. So by the early 1970s, he was redesigning the nervous system of the Chilean economy at the invitation of the socialist government of Salvador Allende. So Stafford Beer was kind of this, you know, a bit of a visionary, but also kind of an odd character, because he was trying to kind of draw inspiration for business and control of governmental faculties in this very cybernetic way of thinking about things. And I find that description kind of fascinating, because he had this idea of kind of literally, I couldn't find a good diagram of it, but he really kind of envisioned like a cybernetic factory that would be kind of controlled by more or less a brain in a vat. And the fact that he was kind of envisioning this as like, it could be literally a human brain in a vat that we take signals from and then try to draw interpretations from that then control some other system. These ultimately did not really pan out, but I do think that his like way of envisioning that is like kind of groundbreaking and fascinating. But in the viable systems model, he was kind of trying to understand autopoietic systems, and he was really an innovator in this way of conceptualizing things. So trying to take influence from ecology and considering systems in a more like open-ended sense, and like in trying to also, you know, cybernetics was trying to apply systems thinking from one area to another. So drawing inspiration from biology or ecology and environmental science, and then trying to apply similar mechanisms in technology. So a lot of these parallels that we have, that we're now very familiar with, like the idea of a mechanized system inspired by a biological system, that is so familiar to us now. But at the time that he was conceptualizing these things, that was absolutely radical. And I guess it's also really important to note that that AI actually kind of emerged from that field of cybernetics, and it's kind of historically understood as more or less a rebranding of cybernetics by a certain faction within computer science that kind of then gained a lot of traction with this rebranded term. But so in the viable systems model, he is trying to kind of conceptualize like how all the parts in a system can kind of function together towards some end. So kind of recalling some of the ideas that we discussed earlier about algorithms, like taking algorithmic constraints and procedures and then applying them in a kind of mechanized fashion to achieve some end. So I thought kind of to take inspiration from that for a drawing exercise, how could we conceptualize our own practices in such terms? So like in terms of an algorithmic system, what kind of algorithmic processes are we applying? What is the input? What is the output? Like what is the mechanism of analysis or processing that gets applied? So I thought we can spend maybe the next 20 minutes sketching, and then the final section will actually like share what we've sketched out and then kind of use that as a platform to discuss this topic. But so the objective I thought we could work from is to sketch out a diagram of your own practice as an algorithmic system. So kind of drawing inspiration from that viable systems model. So what are the kind of key ingredients is like, what's the input? What is the output? What processes or steps are involved? What kind of models can we take insights from, and like what kind of rules or constraints are there? So maybe like we have drawing supplies here, and so maybe we can just start. Everybody can take a piece of paper, and there are colored markers if you feel inspired as well. For you joining online, if you also want to participate, I know it's a little bit difficult doing this like hybrid thing, but if you would also like to participate, then we can share our process later. Well, maybe I'll bring my computer over, and then that way we can kind of move it around. So I don't know if anyone is actually actively watching. Well, there is somebody, but I'm not sure if they're really participating. Because I'm not sure if it's just
Maybe we can.
from the fest. Well, yeah, because Vanini, are you there?
Thank you. Yes, I don't have any kind of paper.
Ah.
So I just
I can.
been listening to you. So.
Okay, cool. Okay, but if you want to, did you do the drawing exercise?
No, I'm just waiting because I don't understand really well what I must do. So.
Okay, but we'll share. Oh, okay. We will share. Hi. So we'll share what the other participants have been doing, and then that way you can kind of get an idea of what's going on here. Would you like to go first? Okay, I'll bring my computer. Oh my God. Okay, well.
Complex. Here's the picture. I can maybe turn it around so everyone can see. So yeah, I'm doing all kinds of music, and I started with this drawing about for past 5 to 6 years. I've been doing a lot of procedural music with pure data, Max MSP, and basically this is the system. So I have numbers, and they go into the algorithm, and then there is sound, and it doesn't really matter what the numbers are. It can be like your brain waves or climate data or whatever I've been working with, and it's just numbers. And kind of every time I talk about them, these are the kind of things that are present for the audience or person who is kind of paying attention, like what is the source and what the actual output is. And then actually the art is really a small thing that only I am aware of. And it's a lot of, like, I had this drawing of these different obstacles that you have to kind of, well, usually it's just, okay, I don't know how to do this, and I don't know how to build some tool, and you have to basically build the tools, and then there is the person experiencing it and kind of asking a question, what is cool about this? Because this is not visible to anyone. And then I kind of had these different, I don't know, this was really just free thought process. So kind of representing how I work with DAWs, so digital audio workstations, where you actually have tools and you just have to learn to use them. And this was kind of comparison between two different processes. And usually the output is better with this process, but I found this much cooler. But then again, is it obvious to audience? And then I was starting to reflect, how about AI? So usually nowadays there is these different tools like Splice or whatever, where you can get copyright-free samples, and production of music nowadays is more about curating content into a coherent collection of sounds. And so in my mind, the first thing that AI will change will be this generation of content, and we still have kind of this curator creating the coherent piece out of it. But
And
then
this human curator.
yes, yeah, definitely human. But of course, when we move towards better and better models, do we need people there? Kind of, who cares? So that's again a question about where do we pay our attention to, output or input or tools that we are using. So is it hard to do, or kind of, this was kind of reflection of different ways to create sounds. And yeah, I don't know.
That's super nice. And I think it's also kind of cool, because I feel like there's this like mediation that's going on here,
Yeah.
with like processing data into sound.
Yeah.
And then you're kind of intervening in that in like several ways, maybe.
Yeah.
Because you're kind of constructing that system,
Yeah.
and then you're kind of also mediating between the audience and whatever it makes.
Yeah.
Because you kind of also have to make a narrative for like what you show, and then
Yeah.
how you tell your audience,
Yeah.
like, you know, like this part, like, what's the point?
Yeah. And that's a tricky part. And of course, the source of data kind of influence what the sounds are, at least in the best case scenario. But sometimes you cannot really create those sounds procedurally. So I don't know, but yeah. Yeah.
So you professionally work with music, yes, with generative audio instruments?
Not really professionally anymore. I play as a musician, but
Okay.
I studied musicology as my bachelor and master's, and I'm doing PhD, kind of different things.
Okay,
Yeah.
you mentioned the Max and
Yeah.
yes, and as it's generative audio
Yeah.
thinking
Software, yeah, or language.
So they're also with data and etc. So
Yeah.
actually similar to a field. Yeah. Okay.
Also, can we show this?
Yeah, sure. That's
This is also something that came out of
It's-
the process.
it's
Really
process.
very
whole.
detailed.
Yeah, that's what I feel when
Wow.
this is what I do when I'm focusing on something and I want to do something with my hands, so I'm just moving.
It's
the
like a
pencil around.
meditative
Yeah.
process.
But yeah, that's me.
Okay, who would like to present next?
Are you guys ready? I can, it's very
Okay.
short, there's not a lot of stuff going on, so this is my head. It's kind of, you know, what comes out of my mouth sometimes, maybe it's kind of strange, so, you know, there's all kinds of things going on in my mind, so there's all this film knowledge, So I observe things, then I kind of keep this knowledge, or I kind of, throw it out, disregard it. Then there's all these, memory banks and stuff, then it kind of goes into the memorized storage, then it comes out to, okay, so choice of topic, ethics, can I talk about this? Should I talk about manners? Maybe that's not the right time to actually say this. Situational awareness, can I say this? Should I say this? Then it goes to the speech apparatus. Then it comes out as, let me tell you about this cool new film I saw. So that's kind of, kind of like a mechanized, I guess, head space.
That's good. I like all the layers of filtering that go on.
Yeah, that's,
Saying something, yes.
I suppose we need that, otherwise it's.
Is that something that comes up often, where you're like the going off script and?
Yes, especially when we are dealing with different kinds of groups of people, new groups of people. You have to kind of,
Context.
whoa, can I, do this? Or should I do this? So yes.
And you're coming from a film background?
Yes, right. Yes, I'm a filmmaker, videographer. So, and I'm studying film also here in Riga with my colleagues here.
In culture, yes.
No, in RIXC, it's like it's new media and filming stuff. So, yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
All right, do you want to?
Go first. Okay, awesome.
I don't know if you're framed. Yeah.
So this is a representation of a racetrack spa, this spa in Trump, and I was thinking about my thesis, my possible thesis project, and basically it's to take data and visualize it in a physical model. So input one would be letting them ride the simulator and getting the data, brake, percentage acceleration, percentage steering angle, heart rate, and then the driver has to drive around the track and basically ask some of the restrictions are at least 5 laps and at least 3 validated laps where they are on the track. So if they make 5 laps, then it goes to the next stage. Have they done at least 3 validated laps? If not, they go back and they start again until they have that. And then is the data valid or metrics? If not, just to go back to the driving again. If yes, the data, this is the second input. The data gets inputted into a CAD application and calculated so that it can be put into graphs. And then can the data be processed correctly? If not, go back. Has the application created 3D models? If the 3D models are good, then it'll print the 3D models. And if they are appropriate, then we frame the model to make an artwork. And then that's it. So still thinking about how to do that.
That's great. Your choice of a system is really lovely, and I feel like it's a really nice way to find a way of framing the process too. It's really good. It's a good example too of how what kind of system we take inspiration from can totally change the result as well.
That's something in terms of insights, how would you find insights on what models to use, insights on what models to use to inform what you're doing?
I guess maybe even relative to what you've been doing, try it out and then these steps in the process of was this good? Putting analytical stops in is this achieving what I'm trying to do? And then yeah, but I guess also it so depends on what your goal is too.
Yeah.
And
and
then what methodologies you're using, and also what the context, which discipline are you using the methodologies from?
Yeah.
To but is that something that you're currently kind of trying to concept?
Yes, that's I want to do this for my thesis. I want to work within the realm of sim racing. It's changed so much. I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. Because so many different pieces of advice. So I'm still thinking, and this is what I'm thinking about at the moment. So it actually helped me kind of think about
Oh, but
it.
that's awesome.
So yeah, but I don't know. Maybe I won't even use this. So, but I hope I can.
That's great. Yeah, but that's kind of great, like getting some distance from it too, like being able to reflect and just kind of go like, okay, is this actually fitting the big picture?
Yeah.
And in a PhD, that's always super hard. Okay, great.
All right. Here's my beautiful work. I called it My Algorithmic System. So here you can see a cat. What does the cat say? Cat say meow. And here where the camera is brought an organ that captures light. So that's our eye. So the eye sees the subject, the cat. So it goes inside the head. And our brain called it our inner processor that receives electric impulses. And so it visualizes the subject that we see here. So the map I drew is like the subject goes through our head. It's like in computers, it's zeros and ones, but in our head, it's nerve impulses, the neurons, they go. Then we can see the subject, the cat. And the model inside, the ones that I found it maybe similar to, is like the relationship between webcam to a screen or a hard drive to a projector that shows a picture on the screen. And the rules and the constraints are that eyes have a limited view of angle, and we also as humans see a limited light spectrum. That's a constraint. People with bad vision or color impairity are at a disadvantage. And also we have a rule that the brain has to be able to process what it sees to visualize it. And also saved photos or videos can become corrupted. So basically the things we see, we tend to forget them or we remember them differently. So yeah, that's it.
That's cool. I feel like you're working with like several different kinds of codes that are coinciding with each other and kind of like how the layers are related to each other.
Yeah, that's it.
And what are you doing concretely? Like you're in the same program too?
We're in the same program, but I finished bachelor's before in audiovisual media.
Okay.
Now it's just new media.
Yeah, we can kind of rules.
I'm at different things, but like mostly a photographer or a director, so I kind of work with ideas and like realizing them somehow into life. And I drew the act of creation, like kind of timeline, because also this type of that system that like inspired this exercise was partially inspired by like the body, but it was body like dissected into organs, and I saw that like very loosely, and I don't like to divide things that much because like to view the body as like separate things attached together, I don't like doing that. I view things as like a whole. So I tried, I guess like the biggest inspiration for this would be like kind of like a river where it's like with time like an unstoppable thing that happens, but it's defined by like different things around it, different things. So there's the past that kind of is affecting the act of creation, but is not necessarily part of it. And these lines are like the things that are actually happening, and these would be like categories where you could like break down the continuous thing that happens. So there is the input would be like me in a specific place and time that defined by the past. And then this input creates some kind of need and want to create something. I don't remember what I draw. And then the next stage is the resources, kind of like bargaining with reality is how I explained it, is how this desire could be like actualized, kind of like carry on transforming. Then there's the death of the idea, which is the stage of the creation, the act of creation, where the idea becomes like a physical creation. So it's kind of like a concrete solidifies in reality. And then the next here it's like, I don't know, it's like very flat, very certain. Like, I'm kind of, whenever, this is, I guess, like the birth of the creation that I see, but it's, to me, the least controllable state. Like, you can control any of this, but this is a very specific thing that just like happens with all the planning and with whatever happens after. Doesn't matter. Then there's the perception of creation. So that's kind of the stage of reflection on the physical creation and contextualizing it. So for example, if there was like an artwork created, it would be like kind of designing how that's presented, or like post-production, like color correction or anything. It's like taking the actual thing that was created and contextualizing it within the artwork. And then the output is the artwork that's created that can have like a life of its own, like whatever is happening with it later is undefined. But that's, so from the desire to the perception of creation, these are like the stages of the creation. Yes, something like that.
I'm trying to understand. So for this part,
Yes.
is that kind of the like ideation, like the idea coming into being?
Yeah, it's kind of
or-
the idea that is uncertain here and that's interchangeable, like becoming an actual thing.
Okay, and then, but it's not the actual, because
But the
then-
actual thing doesn't
the
define the
actual-
final work. It's like what is your contextualization of that thing, and like what is you can like reflect on that and still affect it in some way.
But that's super interesting. I kind of want to conceptualize this as like a, I don't know, my immediate association is like a water turbine, or like
I don't
those,
know what that is.
like those like machines where they take waves and it transforms the wave
Into energy.
into, yeah.
Yeah.
And like just kind of harnessing this totally uncontrollable force, and it becomes like it gets more wild at these different stages, and you're kind of trying to wrangle. I don't know. It's almost like lightning or something, trying to kind of wrangle this uncontrollable force
Yeah.
that you're working with. Or something like
Yeah,
that.
I see that. That resonates.
I don't know if that's the point, but like how I see this is kind of like these lines are
Yeah.
different possibilities. And what I
Yes.
like about this is that the resources, which is external thing, opposed to you, like as a creator,
Mm-hmm.
is really effective, at least in your drawing. So
Yes, there's also a very funny Freudian slip, which I desire resources. That I noticed really there.
but like, who is the creator then? If the external things affect more the output than the internal things, which is really cool and happens, of course. And it's I find.
I don't know. Are you saying that the resources affect the process more than anything else?
No, I mean like what I
mean,
my
I would say that
perspective of
the past that's me affects more, but resources are a huge part of creation. In my
yeah, that's
So,
that's
it is
what I
very
mean.
effective.
Yeah, but like
Yeah.
anyway, like there is a lot of effect on the external forces as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's what's cool in your system.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're kind of at the end. Well, I mean, yeah, I did one, but it's kind of.
We all want
Okay. Well, I'll share it as well. So I don't know if I can do it from this side. Okay, yeah. So I guess the center of mine is like a little being and a kind of perceiving being. So it has like little eyes. And then, so I kind of have like, I don't know, I'm kind of thinking about my own process of like, I spend a lot of time collecting data from like existing data sets. So I'm kind of thinking about like all this massive stuff that's in the world and then kind of gathering it and then like reinterpreting or responding, and then kind of having this like little conveyor belt like image factory that produces something else. But it made me kind of think about like what Jens Hauser was mentioning about where the perception is in all of this. And it made me think about like how things are changed by actually observing, like observer bias kind of actually shapes what we look at. And that made me then kind of think about like this as like a feedback loop that we're kind of in the system, but we're perceiving the system. And by perceiving it, we're kind of changing it. And it made me think about like wave phenomena and how like if you send waves across a body of water, then the returning waves will kind of then impact the waves in a predictable way. So I kind of wondered if like maybe we could measure those kinds of feedback within like a machine learning system or something. And just another thought I had too was like something I'm kind of interested in looking into right now is like, are there remnants of early computer graphics that are kind of artifacts that are like left in machine learning systems that kind of maybe we can find little parts of that in different areas. Do you want to share yours?
Not necessarily, but I can shortly.
Okay.
I'm a simple person. I I do neural network. Yes, and here is an input layer, and here is an output layer, and here are hidden layers. So here I defined who I am, like what kind of field I represent, which is art, research, education. Here is my knowledge, understanding, and observation. Here is ability to adapt. Here is motivation to be fearless and to see patterns that is repeating from the history. And yeah, learning process as a must-have. And actually, I remembered my students that I have to be like I have to be a mediator between my students and technology. So somehow I defined myself, and then there are a lot of hidden layers and a lot of unknown outputs. Yeah, so very simple. Yeah, but
so
yeah,
it's largely shaped by kind of concrete objectives of like
who I am, what I'm doing, yes,
what you need to
and what I need to do to
yeah.
survive this cultural shift, yeah, paradigm, yeah, shift cultural paradigm.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Well, Banini, were you kind of following along? Did you have any reflections that you wanted to add?
Something, but
It's a little hard to understand. Oh, hi.
hello. I'm Vana.
Oh, maybe I can put this up on the screen and then we can see you better. So I'll share actually my
Yeah, it's too dark here. It's raining.
okay. Sorry, I'm still having some
But it doesn't matter. This is not something interesting. Just
there we actually sorry. Oh, sorry, I just need to mirror the display so that okay, there.
this is something more philosophical than art. This is something what I think this is what is the parallel of the data, i.e. internet and the real time. This is something when you put the real time video in the real time and then go this in the part of the video and and the video is changing to the sound, and the sound of this real video changing to some visual things, and then go together and make some negative of this, like also like video, and go in the same time negative and the real time video, and this is something like parallel, you know, the data, live data and live, I don't know, the same two videos in the same time. One made the data from the product from the live video. I don't know, do you understand this?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we're happy. The sound is quite low here because it's not sharing super well, but I can kind of try to explain to the group. But are you working with something like Max MSP or some other?
Yes, I'm a multimedia artist, but now I'm on the PhD, and my team is aesthetic in the AI. So I'm now it's this mix of the practice and writing. So
Okay, great.
so this is the result.
Yeah, so are you guys able to hear any of that? No, okay. But she was saying how it kind of translates between, if I understood, tell me if I'm not understanding correctly, but between video to sound and then back to video again.
Yeah.
And that there's
video,
some.
The visual of video changing to the sound, and the sound of the video changing to the video, and mixed together and made this video with this changing data.
Okay, cool. Okay, yeah. There's this kind of feedback mechanism between the video and sound kind of mutually influencing each other.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry, that's just my computer. Okay, cool. Thank you. And thank you for being so patient and following along all this time. I know it must be.
It's very interesting for me, so.
Oh, great. Okay, that's good.
You.
I
will turn off now.
Okay.
So.
Okay, I'll stop sharing then. Oh, no, stop the share. Okay, so maybe just to kind of wrap up, because we're at the end of our time. But yeah, I hope that this has been maybe interesting or helped you guys maybe pick up tidbits here and there of stuff to like investigate further, and you know, to also just reflect on like, where are we? There's so many aspects of this, and we're all like very individually, like we're not all going to be interested in every aspect of it. And I think that's great also that we have a diversity in here of like visual, more auditory, or like more technical. There's such a mix. So it's nice that it kind of demonstrates also how like this is not, it's not monolithic, like, and maybe also the point of like that we need to figure out our own stance on these things too, and develop like our own unique perspectives, and like that is like really, really crucial going forward in my opinion. So, but if you guys, do you guys have any last questions or comments or insights? Yeah, so that is they're mentioning, oh no, okay. Vanina left the chat, so maybe I'll come to you guys because then I can, oh no, you're still there. Okay, well I'll stay here then. But they're looking at I have these prints that are from a project that I produced in the framework of this European media art platform residency. And so I guess the bigger story is like, so I made an installation, a video installation on site there. I was in residence in Cyprus. And so it was like a very temporary, like my installations tend to be very ephemeral. So I kind of set them up, and then afterwards there's like not really a concrete something that stays. So I wanted to kind of produce something that would stay afterwards. So I made this series of prints, and that just kind of documents how, so I was making this video work where it's distorted through a series of Fresnel lenses. And I was taking a lot of, I tend to do a lot of like appropriation in my work and try to work with like making sense of like all the visual data that we're kind of faced with. And I guess that's like a big thing of what a lot of my work deals with, is like, how do we make sense of all of this? And so in that project, I was working with a local artist there named Alexia Achilleos, and her work deals with like decolonial perspectives on AI. And so we were kind of working together. A lot of the discussions that we had were actually about like the ethics of sourcing data for machine learning systems. And so we were, and kind of together, we were just like looking at a lot of training data and trying to think about like, okay, there's the problem of the models being like often biased or opaque to us. But then like, if we look at the data, like a lot of it contains biases itself, either in its composition or the way that it's sourced. So I was kind of making these videos. I was actually mostly using processing because I like it as just like a very simple graphical way of working with images or data. And so kind of making these videos that like reinterpret existing visual data into another form. And then I was like feeding that through these apparatuses I made of like Fresnel like layers of Fresnel lenses. So that image is kind of the distorted video through the lenses. So that's kind of yeah, that's my synopsis of that. Okay, well, yeah, so I guess we can close here and then, you know, maybe continue the discussion informally if you guys have any questions. Thank you. Okay, Vanina, we're going to close now. So thanks for joining. And I'm going to turn off.
Thank you and goodbye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, bye.